Hey everybody, welcome to another video episode of OK Talks. For anybody who's listening to the audio version on one of the podcast platforms, if you prefer, the show is now up on YouTube. I'm your host, Oliver Kendall. I'm a lifelong political nerd with a background in international relations and security policy who's worked in domestic U.S. politics and also had the good fortune to have visited and lived in a number of countries besides just my own. Channeling those experiences, I do my best on this show to translate what's going on in my own country for my non-U.S. listeners and to help shed some light for the folks back home on some events of note going on in the rest of the world. So in the last episode, where I discussed the weird Republican obsession with everyone having children, I mentioned that there were other things that I wanted to talk about this week. There were, some other things that I wanted to touch on. So here comes that sort of follow-up episode that really isn't actually related to that much of anything that I was talking about in the last one. So as usual, so much has happened that I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to get to everything that I want to touch on here. But there are a couple of things that I feel like I want to weigh in on, since they're not getting either good or enough coverage elsewhere, which tells you right off the bat that this is going to be another episode where I end up kind of taking a swing at the political and foreign policy press, a role that I am not super comfortable in, but one that I found myself increasingly feeling like I have to inhabit. First, though, I want to talk about two entirely separate events that have nothing in common with each other except for two things. Both of them are centered around far-right political figures that I think are absolutely terrible, and both of them were events where the figures in question were speaking before an audience in theory, but realistically were, I think, there actually in order to speak to an entirely different audience that wasn't even in the room. So you may or may not have seen that Donald Trump the other day went to go speak at the National Association of Black Journalists and, well, judging by the way it looked in the room, at least, it did not go very well. Here's just a couple of little samples of this.
You've attacked black journalists, calling them a loser, saying the questions that they ask are, quote, stupid and racist. You've had dinner with a white supremacist at your Mar-a-Lago resort. So my question, sir, now that you are asking black supporters to vote for you, why should black voters trust you after you have used language like that?
Well, first of all, I don't think I've ever been asked a question so in such a horrible manner. First question. You don't even say, hello, how are you? Are you with ABC? Because I think they're a fake news network. And I got treated so rudely as this woman treated me.
Oh, my goodness.
And I'm fine with it because she was very rude, sir. Very rude. That wasn't a question. She didn't ask me a question. She gave a statement. That wasn't a question.
I repeated your statement.
What's your plan for the black community when it comes to money?
So, first of all, it's very hard to hear you for whatever reason because of the fact that they have bad equipment, because I guess, this woman was unable to get the right equipment.
Sir, I have if you don't mind, I'd love to. We have you for a limited time, sir. I'd love to move on to different topics.
Excuse you. You're the one that held me up for 35 minutes, just so you understand.
This whiny, bitchy performance, taking umbrage at totally reasonable questions, attempting to dodge or deflect basically everything that came in, revealed a lot. And I could talk about how obviously uncomfortable this man is in a room full of non-white people, and the fact that his performance there looked super racist without even mentioning his weird, is Kamala Harris actually black? And I thought she was India, but then she became black shtick. But a lot of other folks who are better positioned to talk about it than me have weighed in on that, and their analysis is spot on, so I'll just leave that for now. Also, I want to say, if you haven't already done so, be sure to hit subscribe or follow the channel or whatever it's called on whichever platform you listen. That way you don't miss the next episode, and it's also helpful for the algorithm. Also helpful if you feel like doing me a solid, hit like or leave a comment, and most importantly, share the show with anybody you think might get something out of it. Thanks to anybody who already has, thanks in advance to anyone else who will. Okay, so back to Trump's antics at the NABJ. In addition to the aggressive racial insensitivity, I should say, of it all, I think this performance revealed two things that we sort of already knew, but this makes it a lot clearer. One, this is a profoundly thin-skinned man who really can't handle and has consistently been prevented from facing even the most minor challenge. None of the questions that he got asked at this event were questions that should be difficult for a presidential candidate to answer, which reveals the extent to which he's been sheltered through most of his political career by basically just going on Fox and getting a tongue bath from Sean Hannity instead of actual interviews. And it reveals the extent to which a lot of the press has been kind of gentle with Trump over the years and always graded him on a curve. Like, I remember in the 2016 Republican primary debates, it was like he was in a game of Trivial Pursuit where everybody else was playing with the adult cards, but he was playing with the kid cards. Like, I don't know, we'd get, Governor Kasich, how would you address monetary policy in the context of Chinese currency manipulation and the threat of inflation? And then that guy would give an answer. And then the next question would be, so, Mr. Trump, you've said if you're president, Mexico will pay for a wall across the border. Will it be a small wall or a big wall? The biggest wall. Nobody's ever seen a wall this big. I'm a builder. Okay, I like to build stuff with my totally normal sized hands. Tremendous buildings, tremendous wall. That I can tell you, believe me. And then we just move on to the next question. And bottom line, obviously his bitchy, combative attitude was almost certainly grounded in racial animus and probably some sexism as well. But also just the fact that this man, Donald Trump, is used to being asked even mildly, or is unused to, I should say, to being asked even mildly difficult questions. But okay, I said before, I think it revealed two things. The first being his thin-skinnedness. The second being the fact that the opponent is now Harris. It clearly means Trump's campaign just doesn't know what to do besides retreat to a dark, dirty, racist place in the hopes of making the campaign about race in a way that will both maximize turnout of any super racists who weren't already with him, as if there were any, and potentially goad the Democrats into responding by making the campaign too specifically about identity politics in a way that could turn off voters. These white guys for Harris Zoom events that I've been hearing about. I mean, as far as I know, the Harris campaign actually didn't have anything to do with any of them. But I'm sorry, it does just feel kind of weird. Why do we need to divide ourselves up at all? How about just decent people of all backgrounds for Harris? In any case, yeah, my point is Trump's bitchy behavior at this event makes it clear that he's going to try to push the campaign into being unsubtly about race, which is gross. Because, I mean, think about it. He did not go to this event to have a constructive dialogue with black journalists. He went there to pick a fight. The real audience for this event, for him, thus, was not the people in the room, but rather it was supporters of his who would inevitably see clips of this event, and some set of them, he's hoping and assuming, will react like, look how rude all of those uppity blacks were to Mr. Trump. The audience for this spectacle, thus, were people somewhere else. Which brings me to the second such event that I mentioned at the top. So, a little over a week ago, the Republican senator from the great state of Israel, otherwise known, unfortunately, as the current Israeli Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, spoke before Congress. Now, this just shouldn't have happened, for a number of reasons. First of all, this man should not be the Prime Minister of Israel anymore. He's dragged out the war in Gaza in order to postpone the day of reckoning when he'll justifiably be held accountable for his own government's failures around the attacks of October 7th and for the various corruption charges that he's on the hook for. This is also a man who has actively and aggressively interfered in American politics over the years. Also, he's basically a pariah on the world stage, and him speaking before our Congress makes us look bad. Furthermore, as far as I know, he was basically invited to do this speech by Republicans in Congress without the say-so of the current president of the United States, who Netanyahu has repeatedly disrespected, despite Biden's unswerving loyalty to Israel at a time where it might have been more politically expedient for him to not do that. Netanyahu was basically using the American Congress as a campaign prop. He's wildly unpopular in Israel right now, for the reasons that I mentioned before and others. He is more popular with congressional Republicans who invited him than he is in his own country. And him coming and speaking before the American Congress was an opportunity for him to come look important and in command and pretend that he hasn't done more than any other human being on the planet to undermine the bipartisan support for Israel that had existed in the United States, its most important ally. I'm not even getting into the speech itself, because again, my overarching point here is that it simply should not have happened. But, perhaps predictably, the reaction to his speech by some was disgusting. And unfortunately, the coverage, or selective coverage, of that reaction, yet again, exposes a pretty unsubtle bias among big chunks of the press in favor of basically anyone who is in some way attacking Israel. Now, I want to just say here, because a lot of what I'm going to say in the rest of this episode is going to be somewhat narrowly focused on recent instances of aggressive anti-Semitism and the most recent examples of the bafflingly unfair coverage of Israel in a lot of the press. I just want to say here, if you want to get a better sense for my thoughts more broadly as to the Arab-Israeli conflict and my concern about the profound suffering of civilians caught in the middle, my feelings about the errors of the Netanyahu regime that they've made in the war in Gaza, my belief in the importance of the creation of a Palestinian state, please go listen to episode 63 of OK Talks, because in episode 63, I discussed that more broadly there. I'm sensing this episode is already going to be fairly long, and I want it to be known that I have been and remain deeply concerned about the situation faced by Palestinian Arabs in Gaza, and increasingly the bad situation in the West Bank, exacerbated by Israeli settlers who should not be there and are backed and enabled by radical elements of Netanyahu's coalition. But I also don't want to spend a lot more time in this episode fleshing out that big and important caveat to everything I'm going to say, because, again, this is already looking like it's going to be a longer than average episode, and I'm mindful of, needing to eat eventually and people getting bored of my voice. Basically, bottom line, I am just as horrified by the humanitarian nightmare in Gaza as any normal person, and am extremely unhappy with the various bad things being done by Netanyahu's government. But those are things that are getting a lot of coverage in the mainstream press, for rightly. While, unfortunately, that same press has just totally neglected to mention a bunch of this other stuff, or has framed it in a way that is aggressively biased against Israel. So I'm going to focus in now on those things that you may not have heard quite as much of elsewhere, and hope that you either have already heard episode 63 of OK Talks, or know me in person well enough to know that I think it's critical to be able to keep the competing thoughts in my head of being both concerned for Palestinian Arabs and angry at the Netanyahu government, while also being bothered by unsubtly fair coverage and rising anti-Semitism. In discussing all this, I'm actually going to circle back to the unbalanced Israel coverage and instances of unsubtle anti-Semitism, undercovered anti-Semitism in a second, because, well, I kind of want to vent the broader frustration that I've been having lately with the political and foreign policy press. And before I go too far down that rabbit hole, I have to put in a version of another caveat that I have in the past when I veered in the direction of media criticism, which I never thought would be my thing. I do this partly because I genuinely never have and continue to not have the intention of being a media critic. I'll leave that to experts who are very good at that, like Brian Stelter. It was just never massively an interest of mine before. Also, the Republicans have spent the last couple of decades making an art form out of attacking the media, which is bad for a number of reasons, including the fact that them doing so is basically an unsubtle effort to work the refs, i.e. cheat, and because journalists have a tough and incredibly important job which is critical to the survival of a free democratic society on principle. I like them and don't want to undermine them and the work they're doing. I've also rolled my eyes at the tendency of Republicans to attack the media as a bloc, which is silly and reductive. Not North Korea, we are not Russia. The media does not operate as a bloc in the United States. Not everyone in the media is in total agreement about everything. That being said, frankly, that criticism of the media, to my mind, has actually grown a bit more valid over time. I say that for two reasons. Firstly, because the death of local journalism has exacerbated the extent to which journalism is increasingly a sort of elite profession dominated by a few massive national outlets and populated almost entirely by people who did not come up through the ranks of local journalism as a profession, but rather jumped to the Times or the Post or CNN straight from one of the group-thinky elite colleges and universities. The same universities that have taken billions of dollars over the last couple of decades from Qatar and also couldn't seem to push back even a little bit on the anti-Semitism that, whether or not it dominated the anti-Israel protests we saw this spring, was undeniably at least strongly present at them. That is to say, the profession of journalism, to a greater degree than once was the case, I think, is dominated by people who went to the same set of schools and are, I would argue, at least a bit more likely to see themselves as activists, shapers of a narrative, rather than reporters of facts, than may have once been the case. Secondly, Although, as I say, it tends to be reductive to refer to the media as a block, I've seen over the last couple of years, and certainly the last 8 or 9 months or so, the way in which at least sometimes a big chunk of the media can seem to sort of like adopt a collective narrative and just run with it. One has been the obsession with Biden's age, and yes, I acknowledge that the president's debate performance was an absolute unmitigated clusterfuck. But I also think that it landed harder than it might have because of the drumbeat created in the media over the last 2 years of, oh my God, he's old, and the absolute feeding frenzy that the media engaged in after that debate. Besides all the breathless, oh my God, is today the day he drops out coverage, I'm reminded of the press conference held after the NATO conference a few weeks ago, where Biden spent an hour answering questions from the press in which, yes, he mixed up a few names, but also demonstrated an unparalleled command of the foreign policy space. But, and yes, I counted, more than half of the questions asked at this NATO press conference were stupid horse race and age-related questions, which makes it even harder for me to not see bad intentions there, or at least, not see there a sort of group, oh shit, we can't look like we were too nice to the Democrats mindset. Is also the fact that once Biden basically succumbed to the, when is he going to drop out drumbeat and stepped aside, well, at that point, huge chunks of the media almost immediately shifted to a narrative seeded by the Republicans, by the way, to distract from their own problems about a coronation of Kamala Harris. Like, okay, in my capacity in a sort of leadership position within the global press team of Democrats abroad, I'm hearing from our spokespeople all over the world that they're getting questions from this angle, but doesn't it bother you that it's a coronation of Harris? Come on, let me see you guys fight amongst yourselves a little bit more, please. Like, my God, do they want to write a Dems in disarray story? It's like an involuntary reflex, almost like a muscle memory. Like they just can't seem to help themselves. Just as they can't seem to help themselves from always taking every conceivable opportunity to show the world's only Jewish state in the worst possible light and defend those attacking Israel to the nth degree. So, to circle back to where I left things vis-a-vis the Netanyahu speech before Congress that shouldn't have happened, well, as I said, the speech should not have happened. This man should not be being given the opportunity to use the U.S. House floor to have a pep rally with a bunch of Republican supporters of his. But the reaction to the fact that Netanyahu came to Washington contained a lot of really disgusting behavior that I believe was newsworthy, even if the New York Times and the Post and others saw fit to specifically avoid covering it. So the day Netanyahu spoke, there was a day of rage declared by anti-Israel activists in DC. And for the record, of course, people should be free to peacefully protest in America. It's one of the great things about the liberal West, particularly the United States, which does a better job protecting free speech than perhaps any other country on the planet. Also, at least some, although not all, of what I'm about to describe is legal and should remain so. But that doesn't mean that it isn't disgusting and shouldn't be called out and condemned as such. Which is part of why I'm so angry at the collective, mainstream Western press for basically just skimming past all this stuff that happened. Because you could easily be forgiven for not knowing about it if you only saw sanitized coverage of these protests in the Times or the Post. Although, to be fair, there was a story buried in the local section of the Washington Post a few days after these events about the cleanup that the Park Service had to do as a result of them. But it wasn't especially hard to find video and photo evidence of people around the Capitol openly declaring support not for oppressed and suffering Palestinian civilians, but rather for Hamas specifically, in name, or tearing down and burning American flags before replacing them with Palestinian ones. Here's an excellent bit of footage of one of those flag burnings for you.
Burn that shit! Burn that shit! Burn that shit! Allah! Burn that shit! Allahu Akbar! Allahu Akbar! Allahu Akbar! Allahu Akbar!
Again, this is not Tehran, it's not Raqqa or Ramallah, it's blocks from the US Capitol building all over Union Station. There's one just great picture of a couple of dudes dressed up as terrorists holding their neat little sign, which shows a picture of the Israeli flag with a mushroom cloud over it, captioned, "Allah is gathering all the Zionists for the final solution." Subtle. And if you're tempted to think that this isn't that big a deal, certainly not when compared to how awful the situation is in Gaza right now, which I could understand, Or your mind, for reasons that I could also understand, is tempted to go toward a few bad apples kind of place. Okay. But imagine being a Jewish person living in DC who has to commute through Union Station that day. Here's where I start getting annoyed at big segments of the press. I was easily able to find footage of this on Twitter. A decent bit of it posted, along, by the way, with unambiguous condemnation by liberal Democratic members of Congress, but it didn't really seem to get much attention from the Times or the Post. Now, I have to say, for the record, I don't read those papers cover to cover or watch every single second of television that ever comes on MSNBC and CNN. And by the way, credit to Morning Joe on MSNBC, by the way, for, yes, actually covering this. But like I say, although I don't read every word of the major papers or watch every second of cable news, I did see the Times and the Post's extensive social media postings and stories about these protests, and evidently they made sure to specifically not include any of this shit. Why? Why? What is it about this particular protest movement that makes these hugely important media outlets so determined to protect it from legitimate criticism of its nastier elements? I mean, I have to imagine if a bunch of Trump supporters had a largely nonviolent rally and a couple of them threw on some MAGA-themed white sheets and burnt a cross and there were a bunch of pictures, I think probably at least one of those pictures might work its way into the New York Times' Instagram feed. Why also is it that much of the Western media, which has shown itself to be so ready to blame Israel the minute anything blows up in the Middle East before bothering to actually verify whether it was them, was, by contrast, so hesitant to report on the Hezbollah missile strike in the Golan Heights that killed, I think, 12 Arab-Israeli Druze children playing soccer last week. The BBC headline read, quote, 11 dead in rocket attack on Israel-occupied Golan, almost as though Israel did it itself. The New York Times said, quote, fears of escalation after rocket from Lebanon hits soccer field. Liberal Democratic gay Afro-Latino Congressman Richie Torres summed it up pretty well by saying in response to the New York Times headline, quote, a rocket does not just fall from outer space onto a soccer field. There's a causal agent that fired the rocket. There's a causal agent that bears moral responsibility for murdering the 12 children killed by that rocket. A headline that fails to mention the who behind the what is not information but misinformation. It's not journalism, it's thinly veiled anti-Israel activism, unquote. Can we also just pause here for a second and recognize that this attack on the Golan Heights, Hezbollah doesn't even pretend to be aiming here at a military target. In situations over the last 8 months where Palestinian Arab civilians have tragically been killed by Israeli strikes because they were caught in between the IDF and usually a legitimate military target, the world has been, let's just say, quick to register its outrage. But nobody except the Israelis and the Biden administration really seem to care about these dead Arab Israeli children who were killed in what was, unlike just about every situation in which the Israelis have killed civilians, unequivocally a strike aimed only at a civilian target. Congressman Torres also pointed out another headline in the Washington Post. Here it is. Israel hits targets in Lebanon, which they then put over a picture of one of the Israeli kids that was killed by Hezbollah in that rocket attack. Or as Torres framed it, quote, the front page image of today's Washington Post is that of a child murdered by Hezbollah. Yet the front page headline portrays Israel, not Hezbollah, as the aggressor, unquote. Something big chunks of the press have continued to do in the wake of Israel's extremely successful recent targeted killings of two of the world's most dangerous terrorist leaders. First, in Lebanon, they took out the military leader of the group Hezbollah, the guy who we think is behind that rocket attack, and we think was also involved in the bombing in the 1980s of the U.S. Marine barracks in Beirut, which killed over 200 Americans. The U.S. had a $5 million bounty on this guy's head, and the Israelis went and got him. Then the other day, they managed to take out Ismail Haniyeh, who is just about the top guy in Hamas. Haniyeh left his luxury hotel in Qatar, where he lives off the aid money he's stolen from Palestinian civilians, in order to visit Iran to attend the swearing in of the new president of the Islamic Republic regime that sponsors his terrorist organization. And the Israelis had a bomb waiting for him in his hotel room in Tehran. This is a big deal. Even setting aside the incredible spycraft of it all, Israel having taken out these two men is a big deal. Oh, and it's also been confirmed that a few weeks back they managed to take out Mohammed Dif, one of the top military commanders of Hamas in the Gaza Strip. But again, most of the coverage of this has either poo-pooed its significance or has been framed as, well, there go those crazy Israelis going all cowboy taking out terrorists. How dare they eliminate the masterminds of groups trying to exterminate them and also kill us too if given the opportunity. This might escalate things. I mean, some of the headlines about Ismail Haniyeh specifically, a man who has personally stolen, like, I think billions, if not at least millions, if not billions of dollars in aid money from Gazans, and recently went on Al Jazeera and said, and I quote, "The blood of the children, women, and elderly. We need this blood so that it will ignite within us the spirit of revolution," unquote. That is to say, a specific and unambiguous call for the use of human shields while he hung out in his hotel room in Qatar. Some of the coverage has framed him as like some sort of moderate. Like they've been like, oh, well, he was one of the hostage negotiators and this will piss off Iran, so the Israelis probably shouldn't have done it. Now, I want to be fair here. Some of the debate around whether or not this was a good idea is taking place among Israelis, some number of whom think, yeah, it's possible that this could result in delaying a hostage deal. And that, for them, is a reasonable debate to be having. The other side of the argument, which is also genuine, I think, is that, well, there are very few opportunities to get this guy, since he basically lives in palaces in Qatar and Turkey, again, paid for with aid money he embezzled from Palestinian civilians, and he can't be touched in those two countries. And it's not like he goes to Iran every other Tuesday. This was like sort of an opportune moment kind of situation that is like they didn't want to miss. So the debate around that, I think, is reasonable. Less reasonable to me is the fact that some segments of the Western press immediately went to a position of like, yeah, this was the moderate rapist, murderer, and sacrificer of human shields for the jihadist cause. And like, you know, there's a lot that I don't remember from the early 2010s, but one thing that I'm sure that I don't remember is the first headline after we got bin Laden being something along the lines of SEAL team takes out al-Qaeda leader and 9/11 mastermind, sparking concerns of tensions with Pakistan. I don't remember a lot of protests in Times Square also, mourning the loss of heads of al-Qaeda after we got them. But we did just see that happen the other day for the head of Hamas. Big old crowd of protesters showed up in the middle of Manhattan waving around Hamas flags and portraits of Ismail Haniyeh. I'm sorry, this is news. It happened. There's footage. So then why am I having to read about it in a ridiculous right-wing tabloid rag like the New York Post? I guarantee you, if David Duke dies and a whole bunch of Trump supporters like stage a tearful memorial for him, it'll get covered in the more normal press, as it should. If there was video of, I don't know, a bunch of soccer fans at the Olympics in Paris chanting the N-word when the Nigerian team was playing last week, well, I'm guessing we probably would have heard about it. But there is that video of a bunch of people in the Olympic soccer stadium in Paris the other day waving around Palestinian flags and chanting Heil Hitler, while the Israeli national anthem was playing before a game they were about to play. Here it is. It's kind of hard to make out the audio, but, you know, there you go. It is what it is. Now, this is a couple days ago. If you Google something related to this, you'll see coverage in a couple of Israeli or Jewish-specific outlets, the Times of India, good for them, and USA Today, the newspaper you buy in an airport. So far, the only mainstream American outlet that I've found covering this particular incident. Look, whether you love or hate Israel, whether you love or hate the current Israeli government, whether you're inclined to support the wave of anti-Israel protests or not, you should want the press to cover them objectively, not act as their PR department walking behind them cleaning up their mess, appearing to report on them, while over and over again selectively omitting the nastier bits. Now, I gotta say, watching the way all this has been covered over the last number of months, I'm reminded of something. Like, remember a couple of years ago when Kevin McCarthy just randomly gave a whole bunch of the security footage from January 6th to Tucker Carlson, who then put together a documentary that aired on Fox and basically just spliced together footage from specifically the parts of the Capitol where something wasn't happening at the moment in order to say, look, see, this is footage from January 6th. Nothing happened. There were just some people milling around. This this feels similar to me. Look, I don't think the mainstream media is like a cabal of anti-Semites deliberately covering up the rise in anti-Semitism and intentionally waging a PR campaign against Israel. I do not. But I do think, as I talked about earlier in the episode, that it is possible for big chunks of the media to sort of get caught up in a certain narrative and end up, intentionally or not, framing their coverage around it. We saw it with the feeding frenzy around Hillary's emails in 2016. We saw it with the endless reporting around Biden's age. We saw it with the drumbeat leading up to the war in Iraq. And we're definitely seeing it now when it comes to the way Israel and the conflict in the Middle East and the obviously anti-Semitic elements, not entirety of, the anti-Israel protest movement, in the way that they're being covered or not covered, as the case may be. Two more things I want to talk about this episode, which are in the same vein, but not related specifically to the press of it all. The first is a very dark, very, very bad thing that happened in Israel that I just want to talk about for a minute for a number of reasons, but especially because this incident shows both the fundamental difference between Israel and its adversaries, but also the serious threat posed to the integrity of that difference by the Israeli far right. So, a group of Israeli military reservists are suspected of having abused a Hamas detainee. Let's be blunt. They're accused of raping the guy, which is inexcusable and disgusting. And importantly, the IDF, the Israeli military, agrees with that assessment. They've arrested the guys and thrown them into a military prison to await trial. But then a bunch of far-right nutcases egged on by the two really awfully, fascistic members of Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition, who I've mentioned before, Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, basically stormed into this military base. A mob of supporters of those people stormed into this IDF base to try to spring these guys from the brig. There was at least one actual member of the Knesset, of the Israeli parliament, with the rioters. These people stormed into a military base and attacked their own soldiers to try to get these guys who were accused of raping a detainee out of prison. Netanyahu, like Trump on January 6th, waited a few hours and then issued some milquetoasty statement condemning violence, which didn't go nearly far enough, because of course he did. This chaos resulted in the chief of staff of the IDF, General Herzi Halevi, who presumably had at least a few other things going on. This resulted in him having to call this chaos a threat to the security of Israel and physically show up at the base to help restore order. Now, part of this is because the police in Israel now fall under the jurisdiction of Itamar Ben-Gvir, one of those far-right ministers I mentioned, and were suspiciously late. This is nuts. People like famous Israeli broadcaster Yoni Levy are drawing parallels between this and January 6th for a reason. Now, I think there are a complex set of conclusions to be drawn from this. One is that the far right in Israel represents a serious and growing threat to the basic character of what that country is supposed to be. This ties into what my guest Omri Lavi and I discussed way back in episode 37 of OK Talks about the attempted judicial coup in Israel, the summer before this last one, by Netanyahu and the far right. Another related conclusion is that Netanyahu himself is clearly not equipped nor willing to in any way protect Israel and Palestinian Arabs over whom Israel unfortunately has de facto and, I hope, temporary jurisdiction at the moment from the threat represented by the far right. Netanyahu has got to go, the sooner the better. But also, as terrible as the Netanyahu government is, as reprehensible as the growing far-right faction in Israel is, as represented by these scumbags who tried to break the alleged abusers out of jail, as horrible as the war in Gaza has been and continues to be for the many, many, many Palestinian civilians who have been tragically caught in the middle, one does have to notice the fundamental moral difference between Israel and those it's fighting. Now, to put it bluntly, for Israel, rape is a crime. For Hamas, rape is a tactic. A central part of the attacks of October 7th, lest we forget, were the mass rapes. There's endless witness testimony, forensic evidence, and video footage that Hamas fighters uploaded themselves of the brutal and widespread rapes of Israeli women and men on October 7th. This was part of their plan, to the point where Hamas fighters who took part in October 7th were found with one-page Arabic to Hebrew translation sheets, which included phrases like "take off your pants" and "spread your legs." Now, of course, none of that excuses abuse of Palestinian detainees in Israeli custody. But I think it is worth noticing that the reaction of the Israeli military to the allegation of abuse was to throw the alleged perpetrators in the brig, whether the far right of Israeli society and politics likes it or not. Final thing, and then I'll wrap up the episode. In talking, as I was earlier, about the infiltration of anti-Semitic elements into like the horseshoe far end of the extreme left in America, it's worth noting that this is also unfortunately revealing itself in the Veepstakes, with the attacks on Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro. Josh Shapiro is the wildly popular Democratic governor of the single most important swing state in the country. Seriously, he has like an over 60% approval rating in Pennsylvania, massively outperforms the president and the vice president there. He's also an extremely, extremely good speaker and campaigner, and has been a super successful governor so far. With all that and more being the case, he's obviously one of the top few people being considered for Harris's VP pick. He also, it should be noted, has exactly the same position on Israel as I'm pretty sure do every single one of the other people who are in the running to be Harris's VP. Like I said in the last episode, she's not going to pick Jeremy Corbyn. And yet, unlike with all of the other people in the running, a allegedly grassroots campaign called No Genocide Josh has sprung up to try to stop Harris from picking Shapiro for her VP. This campaign has been put together by the anti-Biden uncommitted movement, the Democratic Socialists of America, which it should be noted is neither Democratic nor socialist, and some other wackadoodle extreme left nutcases. But if Shapiro's position vis-a-vis Israel is the same as all the other people being considered, what's different about him? Oh, right, he's Jewish. Funnily enough, he's actually been more openly critical of Netanyahu than any of the other top VP prospects as far as I know, saying months ago, quote, "I personally believe Benjamin Netanyahu is one of the worst leaders of all time," unquote. He's also on the record aggressively pushing for a two-state solution. Now, since they can't just come straight out and say, yeah, well, he's a Jew, so I don't trust him, the organizers of this No Genocide Josh campaign have latched onto this idea that Shapiro compared anti-Israel protesters to the KKK, something that, again, unfortunately, chunks of the media have been a little bit sloppy in their reporting of. Here's the thing, though. He didn't. He didn't come anywhere close to saying the anti-Israel protesters are like the KKK. Here, in case you're curious, is the actual clip of the quote in question.
They're in. I think what's important is that we can't allow peaceful protest about a disagreement on policy happening in the Middle East to be an excuse for anti-Semitism or Islamophobia on these campuses. We can't allow it to be an excuse that puts certain students at risk to be able to go to classes safely. Students shouldn't be blocked from going to campus just because they're Jewish or learning in a classroom as opposed to being forced online because they're Jewish. It is simply unacceptable. And you know what? We have to query whether or not we would tolerate this if this were people dressed up in KKK outfits or KKK regalia making comments about people who are African American in our communities. I'm certainly not condoning that, Jake, by any stretch. But I think we have to be careful about setting any kind of double standard here on our campuses. We got to call it out for what it is, and these university leaders have to make sure there is order on their campuses.
There. That's it. This wasn't even like an unfortunate gaffe where Shapiro accidentally vented his private frustrations with the protester. No, not only that, what he said, his analogy about people dressing up in outfits that specifically evoke terroristic violence is exactly correct. And the only reason more people don't know that is because huge chunks of the press, for whatever reason, decided to specifically not really show those elements of the protest where people were basically dressed up in terrorist cosplay, like the examples I included before of the ones in DC and plenty of others from the campus protest this spring. Shapiro's analogy was factually completely correct and frankly inoffensive to anyone except people who think it's totally normal to cosplay as genocidal terrorists as part of their peaceful protests. The only people who think that Shapiro's quote was out of line or he compared protesters directly to the KKK or, all of them or is against the notion of peaceful protest or whatever. The only people that think that are, one, people who haven't actually heard the quote and have just heard it characterized, or two, People who were straight up unaware that there were widespread instances of aggressive anti-Semitism mixed in with the protests, which most of the other protesters appear to feel no need to condemn or reject, so interpret that however you want. Or 3, people who don't think that, open anti-Semitism at protests is actually a bad thing. On the basis of various of the things that I've spelled out here, Congressman Ruchi Torres, who I mentioned before, and a bunch of others, have called this No Genocide Josh campaign, targeting the only Jewish candidate in the running whose positions aren't meaningfully different from the other candidates. They've called that campaign anti-Semitic. And yeah, I, for the record, am super excited about all the people being considered for VP. Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, Arizona Senator Mark Kelly, Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg, Shapiro. Any one of them would be wonderful for the job, even if they weren't being directly compared to J.D. Vance, who is a weird, sexist, reproduction-obsessed creep. For more, see the last 2 episodes of OK Talks. But I gotta say, I really hope that Harris picks Shapiro at this point. Not just because he delivers Pennsylvania on a silver platter and that's the electoral ballgame, not just because I think he'd be a great vice president, but also because picking a Jewish person, someone who would be the first Jew ever to win a national election in America, would send a strong message to the gross anti-Semitic horseshoe left that the Democratic Party gives no quarter to anti-Semites, and we will not abandon our liberal values in order to cater to an unreliable fringe constituency that would hold our coalition, and by extension the country itself, considering everything on the line in this election, hostage over a single issue. Like I say, I would be thrilled with any of the people Kamala Harris is considering. But Harris Shapiro 2024. All right, that's it for this episode of OK Talks. If you like the show and want to make sure to not miss the next episode, be sure to hit subscribe or follow the channel or whatever it's called on whichever platform you're listening or watching. If you really want to do me a solid, be sure to hit like and leave a comment, and most importantly, be sure, please, to share the show with anybody you think might get something out of it. Thanks to anybody who already has. Thanks in advance to anyone who will. Thanks as always to my good friend Nate Wright for having designed the podcast artwork, and to everyone else for listening.